This whole story with former President Duterte and the ICC, it's like every time we look at it, there's some new development. And they're not just legal developments, they're very personal, family members trying to visit legal teams, strategize. It's like watching this very human drama, but on a global stage.
It really is, and that's why we wanted to do this deep dive today. We've got a really in-depth report here that covers so much ground. Honeylet of Avanceña trying to see him, Vice President Sarah Duterte's trip, the fact that the ICC prosecutors already submitted evidence, wow, that timeline for the confirmation of charges, and of course the Philippine government trying to figure out exactly where they stand on all of this.
Okay, so let's break it all down and really get into what it all means for you, the listener. Starting with those visits, it sounds like it hasn't been easy for family members to actually see the former president.
Yeah, there were two separate times when Honeylet of Avanceña tried to visit him at the ICC detention facility in The Hague, and neither one was successful.
And, the timing of these visits is interesting, right? With his birthday coming up on March 28th, it feels like there was this real urgency, this need to be with him, especially when you add in the detail about supporters being there offering birthday greetings. It really makes it so much more personal.
Absolutely, and I think it's important for us to keep that personal aspect in mind as we go through these legal proceedings. There's this whole other side to it, and then the report mentions that one of his lawyers actually apologized to Mrs. Avanceña and promised to try again, maybe with their daughter Veronica on his actual birthday or even Saturday. So you can tell they're really trying hard to make that family connection happen.
And then we have Vice President Sarah Duterte's visit. She wasn't able to see her father either, but it wasn't a wasted trip, was it?
Not at all. She was able to collect 4 suitcases and a bunch of balikbayan boxes that were intended for him. Apparently, they just couldn't bring them all into the detention facility.
And they made a point of requesting that no one should film the building or anyone going in or out, right? Which you have to think speaks volumes about how sensitive this whole situation is.
Oh, definitely. This is an ongoing legal case at the international level, and there are very strict rules in place for a reason, both for security and privacy. So moving on to the actual legal process itself, I think the biggest news here is that the ICC prosecutor has already submitted the first part of their evidence.
Yeah, and remember, the deadline for that disclosure of evidence wasn't until April, so they're way ahead of schedule, and the report says the defense already has their copy, so this feels like a pretty huge development, and it makes you wonder, are they just super confident, or are they trying to set the tone early on by being so proactive?
It's definitely a key moment, and to really understand it, I think it's helpful to bring in the perspective of Gilbert Andres. He's an ICC-accredited lawyer who's assisting victims in this case, and he believes that this early evidence is probably a lot of the same information that was used to get the investigation warrant in the first place.
Yeah.
So even though we don't know the specifics yet, it gives us a sense of what the prosecution is basing their case on.
So it's like laying the foundation for their arguments. And now we're moving towards that next big milestone, the confirmation of charges hearing, which is set for September, 6 months after Duterte appeared at the ICC. That feels like a long time, but I guess these things take time.
They do. And that 6 months gives both sides plenty of time to get their arguments and evidence in order. And Dr. Fadil Abdallah, he's the ICC spokesperson, he explained that the judges in this pretrial chamber 1 are basically deciding whether there's enough evidence to go to a full-blown trial. They'll be looking at the prosecution's strongest points and deciding whether there really was a systematic attack happening as part of this drug war. And it's important to remember that at this stage, it's not about proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, just whether there's enough to move forward.
So it's a lower bar to clear, and it won't just be the prosecution making their case, right? Both sides get to present arguments and even cross-examine witnesses. It sounds like a major legal showdown.
Absolutely. And even though all the witnesses in this case are victims, they probably won't all be called to testify in person. Most will be represented by their lawyers. But sometimes in very specific cases, the judges might allow 1 or 2 victims to share their stories directly with the court, not to accuse anyone, but just to give their perspective on what happened. It's powerful to think about them getting to speak on that kind of global platform.
It really is, and now we know when that'll happen. The hearing starts on September 23rd, and it could last up to 3 days, and then there might be another 6 days before the court makes its decision. So that's a very specific timeline to keep in mind. And the report also gets into that initial arrest warrant mentioning the killings that were carried out by the Davao Death Squad and by law enforcement.
And this is a key point legally, because what the report highlights is that even a single murder can be considered a crime against humanity if it's part of a bigger attack on the civilian population. So it's not just about how many people were killed, but the context, the pattern of the killings, and how widespread they were.
Okay, so looking past that September hearing, there's also the possibility of even more hearings before then, right? Either for procedural things or if Mr. Duterte's lawyers decide to make a specific request.
It's exactly. Dr. Abdullah mentioned that the court could call hearings before September 23rd if there are procedural issues to work out, or if the defense team files for interim release, and they would consider that kind of request. But a big factor would be whether the country receiving Mr. Duterte would agree to the ICC's terms for release. It adds a whole other layer to this.
Which brings us to the Philippine government and their position on all of this. They're walking a really fine line here.
Yeah, and I think their careful language shows that they want to uphold their international obligations, but also be mindful of the political situation at home, especially with how sensitive people are about the former president.
Right, so Malacanang's statement is that they are obligated to surrender Mr. Duterte because they're a member of Interpol, but they're very careful to say it's because of Interpol, not necessarily because they recognize the ICC's jurisdiction in this specific case. And they're also making it clear that they'll need consistent, direct cooperation from the ICC for this to work.
Right, and then there's this whole other point they bring up about cooperating on interim release and how that could lead to other things like freezing assets. So basically asking if the Duterte family would even want that level of involvement from the ICC. It just makes the whole thing that much more complicated. And the report mentions that they're still waiting for a response from Duterte's side about all this.
It's a really fascinating look at the political maneuvering that's happening behind the scenes. And then you have Mr. Duterte's former legal counsel, Salvador Panelo, who's publicly said that they would much rather have Mr. Duterte stay in the Philippines, and he doesn't think he's a flight risk. So clearly they're sticking to their argument that the ICC has no jurisdiction here and that he's innocent.
And, with the ICC, it's interesting because when they say someone isn't a flight risk, it's not just about whether they'll literally run away. It's about their ties to the country, their willingness to show up for court,
Yeah.
and whether they've tried to escape justice in the past. It's a whole legal argument.
And going back to those family visits for a minute, the report mentions that Honeylet Avanceña and their daughter Veronica tried to see him earlier this month too, but couldn't. So it really shows that this wasn't just a one-time thing. They're really trying to keep in touch. And there's this really touching part where Kitty Duterte said all she wants for her father's birthday is for him to be healthy. It makes you think about the impact this is having on everyone involved, the very human side of it.
It does. And the report also mentions that there's going to be a gathering of Mr. Duterte supporters in front of the detention facility in The Hague on his birthday with a whole program and even a picnic. So you can see the support for him is still very strong, both in the Philippines and around the world.
So just to sum it all up for you today, we've covered those attempts to visit former President Duterte, the fact that the ICC prosecutors already submitted evidence that crucial confirmation of charges hearing coming up in September, and the very different positions that the Philippine government and Mr. Duterte's team are taking on cooperating with the ICC. It's a lot to take in, but it shows that this situation is far from over.
Definitely. This is where international law and domestic politics collide, and then you layer on top of that all these very personal stories. It's complicated. And the ICC's investigation has huge implications, not just for Mr. Duterte himself, but for the idea of holding people accountable for crimes and achieving international justice.
And that leads us to our final thought for you, the listener, as you think about all these different perspectives, the worried family members, the lawyers planning their strategies, the Philippine government trying to find a balance, and the victims who just want justice. What does this whole situation tell you about the relationship between national sovereignty and international justice? Where's the line? And what does it make you think about how we achieve accountability and ensure fairness in cases like this, cases that are so complex and have so much at stake?
It's something we all need to think about.
It really is.